What's going on, guys? We're having a great day today. Today we're going to continue our discussion in the book of Job. We're reading chapter 38, verse 19 and verse 30. And we're going to be pondering the question, does man do it? See, throughout this chapter, God has asked Job many questions. He continues on in these next verses of just asking Job these questions that should elicit the response, no. But not merely no, but a humble no. A humble yielding to God, a humble submitting to God as we recognize that we are but dust. As we recognize that we are but frail men created by God, and that God alone is the creator of all things, that God alone sustains all things, that God alone upholds all things. And it ought cause that understanding to come into our minds and our hearts, that we might submit and yield to the great God of glory, the great Lord who created all things. But notice that in the last 7 verses, God questions Job about the authority, the power, and the ability of man to control the great things of creation. Right? We recognize in the last verses God asked him about the sun. God asked Job about the vast seas, about the oceans. Does Job create them? Does Job explore them? Does he know the breadth of the earth? Does man understand the great mysteries of death and the gates of death? See, these are the great things. But now God once again continues his questioning of Job, yet in simpler matters. Yet nonetheless, all things too great for man, even though they are simpler. So, of course, man can't control the great things of the sun and of the earth and of the great oceans. But we see that neither can man control and have the power and the wisdom to control simpler things of creation, like the snow and the rain and the wind and the light. That man can't control the great things, yet furthermore, he can't even control the lesser things. And I say lesser in the sense of scale and power and glory. But we read here in Job chapter 38, verse 19 to verse 30, the Bible says this: "Where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the paths of the house thereof. Knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath engendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen." So if we read verse 19 to verse 21 again, we see that the mysteries of light, that man in his understanding and wisdom can't understand the full greatness of these truths. But it says, "Where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the paths to the house thereof. Knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great?" And I want to start off by saying that these things are too great for me. I am no scientist. I don't understand how light travels and how it disperses and all the molecules that are involved in that. I know nothing of the sort. This is far over my head. But the question still remains, Joe, where does light and darkness come from? What is their origin? And you must understand here too that God is asking the question to Job. And we must understand this is thousands of years ago. That mankind at that time had no understanding that we have today, the scientific understanding anyways, of light and how it travels and how it disperses and all these things. But nonetheless, we ought not gain a big head because we have greater understanding in these matters, that they still are far past our understanding in the sense of the greatness of how light is formed and how it travels and how God alone created it. Right, clearly, light comes from sources of light. In this context, probably the sun, as God has before spoke of the sun, that God put the sun there, that God caused the sun to rise and to set by the rotation of the earth, that God placed the sun where he placed it, that sometimes the days are longer, sometimes the days are shorter, and that's all by the sovereign design of God, and man has no ability to lengthen the day. Man has no ability to shorten the day. It is God alone that disperses the light and causes the day. But furthermore, fundamentally, right, light, we see that light comes from light, right? The sun shines light upon the earth, therefore we have light. But that light is fundamentally the release of energy. But how do these photons and such create it, and how do our eyes perceive it? And again, I know there's probably some scientific explanation. It's just as far above my own head. But nonetheless, these great things of how light travels and how we perceive light and how we perceive darkness in the absence of light. While man can understand it and study it, God alone can create it. And yes, we have flashlights and things of the sort where we can artificially create light, but there is no greater light than the sun in our solar system. And even then, man is just using what God has created. Man is not inventing light. Man is merely using something that God has before created. And we must understand this, that we don't gain a prideful heart in this matter. Like I said, of course, written to Job thousands of years ago, we have greater understanding in the scientific study of light and how light functions. But remember this, that science is simply growing in knowledge of God's created world, not man causing the creation. Right, we are studying it, we are examining it, and in some sense we can harness it to our advantage. But God alone has created the fundamental laws that make up these things. Thus, man not get a big head, man not be proudful in this. But as we understand more of the creation, we ought to give God all the more glory, for He alone created it. The very foundations of it, the very fundamentals of it, God alone formed. And put in this way, the commentator Barnes writes this: the effect of the discoveries which are made in the works of God is not to diminish our sense of His wisdom and majesty, but to change mere wonder to praise, to transform blind amazement to intelligent adoration. Every new discovery of a law of nature is fitted more to impress the mind with awe, and at the same time it becomes the basis of a new act of intelligent confidence in God. This is true of snow as of other things. That recognizing creation, understanding creation, growing in a greater knowledge of creation is not to puff man up, but is to turn our praise to God as we see His handiwork. That the more you begin to understand something, the more you understand of how it's all made up, of how it all works, of what forms it, it makes the matter a much more amazing thing. And so too it is of light, that we don't really truly understand how light is dispersed as it is. But even as we grow in understanding of that, we see that God is the one who formed it all. God is the one who created it all. Therefore, He is the one worthy of praise and honor and glory. And if man ever wants to get a big head or be proudful in the fact that he has harnessed light, or in the fact that he might understand light, let it be known that man could never replicate the greatest light in our solar system, the sun. That man cannot take light by the hands and cast it to its bounds, as it says in verse 20. That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof. That man does not grab hold of light and take it. That man has no such power. But God alone does. God can cast light where He desires to cast light. Right in Genesis, we see that God spoke and there was light. And that was before even the creation of the sun. And I don't know how exactly that took place, but we see that God has full control and authority and sovereignty over light, while man has no such control as God does in that regard. But then we also see in verse 21 where God asks him a rhetorical question, right? Knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? So if we ever think we are too smart or we have too great understanding, let it be known that God has been there since the foundations of the world, before the foundations of the world. He's eternal. Man's days are but short in comparison to His. Thus let us never grow in arrogance, but a humble yielding to God. And if we look at verse 22 to verse 23, we see that God can use weather to bring judgment. In verse 22, hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? Or has man seen it? Has man entered into his storehouses? Of course, the answer is no. And right, let's understand that it's not likely that there's a literal storehouse of snow and hail that God has in some closet. But no, rather, God has an infinite supply of snow and of hail and of these things of weather, for he alone creates it. That God's supply is infinite, for he forms it all and casts it upon the earth. And that man does not have access to God's ways and supplies in the process that God uses to create these things. That man has not seen the storehouses. Man has not understood how God causes it all to happen as he does. For once again, we might study the creation, but God is the one creating it. God is the one who has created it. God is the one who has set it in motion. Thus his understanding and his ways and his thoughts are far higher than our own, as we are merely studying, but he is the one who's created it and brought it into existence and brought it into fruition. But notice in verse 23, he talks about the days of battle. In verse 23, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, that he's reserved snow and the things of hail for the times of trouble, against the day of battle and war. And man has not seen it. Man has not known it. But God alone has. And if we just look at some examples, of course, God brings the regular hail. But in these times of battle and war, we've seen throughout the scriptures multiple examples. I'm going to go through two prominent examples of God casting hail upon the earth in a time of battle and a time of war. And we see that God's formation of it and the hail that he uses is far greater than anything we've ever seen or beheld. And so the first example is found in Revelation chapter 16, verse 21. It says, and there fell upon many, and this is the judgment of God upon the world, right? It's Revelation. And there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And that weight of a talent, more modern translations put it as 100 pounds. But we see that's around 60 to 100 pounds, things like that size hail, which we have never seen. But it says, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceeding great. So we see God casting hailstones 100 pounds to the earth on the judgment of man. And man can replicate no such thing. But furthermore, we go to Joshua 10:11, it's something that has already come to pass, as we see in the Old Testament. But it says, and it came to pass, and this is the people of Israel fighting against the nations, taking back their land, right? And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel, and were in the going down to Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. Again, God cast down these hailstones in judgment against these nations in a time of war, in the time of battle. So we see the power of God in these things. And we see that man can replicate no such thing as God, casting down hailstones of 100 pounds to the destroying of nations, to the destroying of armies in his righteous judgment. Man can do no such thing. They slew more than the Israelites did with their sword by the casting of these things. And of course, we have probably the most known one in the book of Exodus, where God brings the hail upon the Egyptians. Now, this wasn't 100-pound size hail. It wasn't just destroying everything, but it did destroy livestock and animals. So we see the power of God in that and the judgment of God in that. That he brings down the hail in times of war, in times of battle, as his righteous judgment demands. And man cannot replicate a single thing. And as we move on to verse 24 to verse 30, we're going to see that God provides abundantly. And there's not really much that I could think of expounding here. But we just once again see God's independence and man's dependence upon this great God, that it'll humble us and cause us to yield. In verse 24, by what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. So again, we see the independence of God, that God causes these things and man does not. Right? In verse 24, man does not send the light of the sun, nor does he send the east wind. Right? Man has no control over these things. Man is simply on this earth as it rotates. and the sun comes up at day and goes away at night. And we see that God alone can cause this, that man has no such control of the outpouring of the light of the sun upon the earth. Yet God alone. And we see in verse 25 that man has not caused the rain to fall in channels as it does, nor does he direct the lightning to its target. You know, it's an amazing thing, and I know we saw this a couple chapters ago with the argument of Elihu, but it's an amazing thing that when the rain comes, it does not fall as one ginormous waterfall that just destroys everything in its path. But it's like the rain, by God's ordaining and providence in it, falls in channels, in small drops, sometimes bigger drops, but relatively small drops that are good for the earth, that are not just destroying everything like a big waterfall coming from the sky, but they fall as though they're falling through channels and in little streaks upon the earth as God commands them. But furthermore, we see again that man does not direct the lightning to his target. That God commands the lightning and God directs the lightning, and the lightning strikes where God has ordained it to strike. And that man has no such power over the great lightnings of a great thunderstorm. Yet God alone does. God alone does. And we see in verse 26 through verse 27 that where no man is, right, where no man is dwelling, the earth is still watered and provided for. And again, this is to show us that man has so little control over the world, that man might think himself as some kind of great provider over the earth. But we see even where no man is living, God is still providing for that land. God is still watering that land. God is still providing for the animals and the creatures there in that land. Just showing the complete independence of God. That even if man was not here, God would sustain the world as he does, without the help of man, without the assistance of man, without the ideas of man. No, God does it all, for he alone can. He alone is wise enough and powerful enough. But notice that God provides for it. He does not need help from man. And I do want us to notice this, that we see in Genesis that God gave man dominion over the earth. So this is not diminishing the role of man. It's not diminishing the importance of man by any means. But to show us that God has all the power, and while he's given man dominion over the earth, we are to be stewards of what he has given us. That's always and ultimately God giving, and us just being faithful with what he has given. Us submitting to him and following as he leads. Us using the wisdom that he has given us in a godly way, in a godly manner, and not in an ungodly way. Right? That God has given man dominion over the earth, and it is a good thing. However, man was never to do it solely by his own ability. That even when we see Adam and Eve in the garden, that it says that God walked amongst them. That God did not just place man here to live his own life, to go his own way, but God placed man here that he might have fellowship with man. That he is to be worshipped by man and praised by man, absolutely, but it's also fellowship. That it's a good thing for man to have dominion over the earth. But as soon as man becomes prideful and tries to go his own way, he has overstepped his bounds. He has rebelled against the God who gave him the dominion over the world, over the earth. And he has failed to submit to this great God of glory. And it's a wrong thing. It's a sinful thing. It's an evil thing. It's a foolish thing. But furthermore, we see in verse 20 to verse 29 that rain and ice were not generated or birthed, as it puts it, by mankind. That the elements are not something that mankind has any jurisdiction over, and that God alone causes these things. Right? Once again, man does not bring the rain. Man does not cause the wind. Man can control these things in some regard, right? We have wind turbines and fans that kind of harness wind and use it for our ability and for our good, absolutely. But man does not cause them. Man does not create the great winds. Yes, of course we have fans. But again, that's a small little detail. It's a small little area. But God causes winds to blow across all the world. And man has no such power. Man has no such ability to do this great thing. Right? It can be controlled and replicated in part, but yet nowhere near how God alone can send and command it. That God sends the rain, God sends the wind, but man cannot send it in the great scale that God alone does, nor can. And then we see in verse 30 that man cannot cause freezing temperatures in nature. And notice here the idea, it says it's hid like a stone. Right, let's read it for a moment. Verse 30, the waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. And so the idea here is that the top layer is frozen solid, and it kind of sort of hides the water beneath it. So it's hid as with a stone. So we see the top layer is hard, and the bottom layer is hid because of the hard crust on the top of the water. But again, man can replicate these things to an extent. Right? We have things such as freezers and ice rinks, or where we do freeze things and we cause the water to go below freezing temperatures and to become hard and hidden in that way. So man can replicate to an extent, yet he cannot cause the temperatures of the air to become freezing. Then a small isolated scale, man can cause these things. When we're talking about the global scale of the world, man can do nothing of the sort. Yet God alone brings the seasons. God alone brings the heat of the summer and the freezing of the winter. On a global scale, right? You have the northern hemisphere being in summer while the southern hemisphere is at winter, and God causes all these things at the same time. And that God alone can do these things, and not man. So while man can study them, while man can replicate them to an extent, to grow in arrogance, as we just see the Creator doing it on an infinitely greater scale, is foolish and sinful. But in conclusion, God knows all these things, right? God knows all things. Man knows very little, right? God is questioning Job here. And really, while he's questioning Job, it can easily be applied to the questioning of mankind at large. For no man has the power to do these things. No man has the answer ultimately to these things. So God knows all things, yet man knows very little. God controls and sustains all things by his power, sovereignty, and wisdom, and man has no such power. Man does not have the power to create the world. He does not have the power to sustain the world. Man does not have the wisdom to create the sun and cast his light during the day and make it dark at night as the earth rotates. Man has no such wisdom or authority or power, yet God alone. And so the conclusion of the matter, and it's the conclusion of this matter, but obviously we're going to continue to see it throughout the next chapters as God questions Job. And it's always the same conclusion. Yet God is just pounding into the heart and mind of Job and us as well as we read that we're to trust this great God and obey him. That he is worthy to be trusted, for his mind and his will and his wisdom and power is infinitely greater than our own. And he's good, he's righteous, he's holy. So to go astray from him is foolish, it is sinful, it is ignorant. It lacks no sense. It lacks all sense. So we are called just to trust God and obey God, even in great tribulations and calamities and difficulties as Job is going through. The whole purpose is to not question God in a demeaning, arrogant, entitled way. It's not to point fingers at God and to blame God and to wag our head at God. No, it's to submit to God, to yield to God, the creator of all things. So let us trust him. Let us obey him. Let us love him. Let us serve him. And let us praise him and worship him as his holy name demands. For he is good. He is righteous. He is holy. He is almighty, all sovereign, all wise. Let us trust and obey this great God. Ours, Mary, you're not alone. Jesus loves you. I love you. Have a blessed rest of your day.